Pierre Janssen, a French astronomer, wanted a record of Venus passing across the Sun, an event that took place in 1874. He developed what he called a revolver photographique, which was a cylinder-shaped camera in which a photographic plate revolved. The camera automatically took pictures at short intervals, each on a different segment of the plate. The result, photographed by Janssen in Japan, was not yet a motion picture, but it was a step in that direction, and it gave ideas to others. About the same time, English-born Edward Muybridge was doing experiments sponsored by Leland Stanford, the former governor of California. Stanford, who was a horse breeder, sensed that the devices used by his trainers to improve gait and speed were based on imprecise knowledge of how the horse actually ran. Muybridge, who was already a celebrated photographer, undertook to provide data. He placed a series of cameras, at first 12 and then later several times that many, side by side along the track. From these cameras, parallel threads ran across the track. A horse galloping through them clicked the cameras in swift succession. The photos gave information on each stage of the gallop. The study of animal motion became an obsession for Muybridge. By 1880, he had learned to project sequences of his photos with an adaptation of the magic lantern, and thus to present a galloping horse on a screen at various possible speeds. The results were eye-opening to many who saw them. Muybridge had foreshadowed a crucial aspect of the documentary film, that is, its ability to open our eyes to worlds available to us, but for one reason or another, not yet perceived. Muybridge applied this technique to numerous animals and later to men and women, athletes, dancers, and others, sometimes photographed in nude sequences. These often evoke the poetry of ordinary, familiar actions. The celebrated French physiologist Etienne Jules Marais followed the work of Janssen and Muybridge with intense interest. Having seen a Muybridge galloping horse projection, Marais wanted to do something similar with bird flight, but birds could hardly be made to trip a series of threads on a pre-selected route. So Marais followed Janssen's lead, devising a fusil photographique, or a photographic gun, with which he could follow a bird in flight while shooting at split-second intervals. At first, as in Janssen's camera, the photos were successive images on the same glass plate. But in 1877, he switched to strips of photographic paper, and the following year to celluloid strips, putting 40 images on one strip. Besides birds in flight, he shot such phenomenon as a cat falling backwards from a height and landing on its feet. He too learned to project the results on a screen, and he was approaching motion picture technology, but his embryo documentaries were scarcely 3 or 4 seconds long. Georges Demeny, who began as an assistant to Marais, was especially interested in problems of the deaf. He felt deaf people could be taught to lip read and perhaps even to speak if they could see over and over the characteristic mouth movements connected with sounds. So, in 1892, with his own adaptation of Marais' equipment, he began to shoot and project close-ups of mouths articulating short phrases. Again, an experimenter with special interests provided intimations of things a documentary film might be and do. The achievements of these and other experimenters were widely heralded, but it remained for protein professional inventors like Thomas Edison and Louis Lumiere, both of whom were racing against scores of other inventors throughout the world, to develop the experiments into a commercial reality and an industry. To some extent, Edison shared the documentary ardor of the early experimenters. Before he created his peep show, Kinetoscope, launched with explosive but short-lived success in 1894, he had met Muybridge and Marais and discussed their work with them. Edison himself often spoke of the archival and instructional value of motion pictures and sound recordings in both education and business. But in practice, his film work quickly took on a show business direction. In the end, it was Louis Lemaire who made the documentary film a reality, on a worldwide basis and with sensational suddenness. The reason why Lumiere and not Edison played this key role is rooted in sharp contrast between their technical inventions. The camera with which Edison began film production was an unwieldy monster. Several men were needed to move it. Also, Edison was intent on integrating the invention with another Edison specialty, that is, electricity, to ensure an even speed of operation. For both these reasons, the Edison camera was at first anchored in the tar paper covered studio called the Black Maria, built at West Orange, New Jersey. This camera did not go out to examine the world. Instead, items of the world were brought before it to perform. As such, Edison began with a vaudeville parade of dancers, jugglers, contortionists, magicians, strongmen, boxers, and cowboy rope twirlers. They appeared at a fixed distance from the camera, usually against a black background, deprived of any context or environment. The Louis Lemaire camera, on the other hand, launched in 1895, was totally different. It weighed only 5 kilograms, which was about 1/100th of the weight of the Edison camera. Known as the cinematograph, it could be carried as easily as a small suitcase. Hand-cranked, it was not dependent on electricity. The world outdoors, which offered no lighting problems, at least during the day, became its habitat. Louis Lemaire, the first magnate of documentary film, was the son of Anton Lumiere, a painter who had turned to portrait photography, photographing well-to-do clients against backdrops he had painted. Louis and his brother Auguste received a technical education, but Louis left school at an early age because of severe headaches and took up laboratory work for his father. While still a teenager, Louis invented a new procedure for preparing photographic plates. The Lumieres began to manufacture plates for others using Louis's new formula. The family ultimately sold the studio and, on the outskirts of Lyon, organized a factory to manufacture plates. By 1895, the factory had 300 workers, sold 15 million dry plates a year, and was the leading European manufacturer of photographic products, surpassed internationally only by the Eastman plant in Rochester, New York. In March 1895, at a meeting in Paris to promote French industries, Louis Lemaire demonstrated his invention with the short film, Workers Leaving the Lumiere Factory. In June, he gave a demonstration at a photographic meeting in Lyon. This time, he photographed convention members, including the astronomer Janssen, as they arrived by river steamer. The next day, at the meeting, he let them see themselves disembarking. The familiar, seen anew this way, brought astonishment. Other closed showings were held for scientists in Paris and a photography assemblage in Brussels. One of Louis Lemaire's most successful films was Arrival of a Train, which compelled some viewers to scream and dodge. As we see passengers leave the train, some pass close to the camera, seemingly unaware of it. The use of movement from a distance toward the viewer and the surprising depth of field in the sequence offered audiences an experience quite foreign to the theater and different from anything in the Black Maria performances. While a few of these early films involved deliberate performances for the camera, such as feeding the baby and watering the gardener, most were actuality items. None used actors. Louis Lemaire rejected the theater as a model for motion pictures. He presented instead a panorama of French life that grows more fascinating as the years recede. These include fishermen in their nets, a boat ride, swimmers, firemen at work, men sawing and selling firewood in a city street, a bicycle lesson, a demolition of a wall, children at the seaside, a blacksmith at work, a potato sack race at a Lumiere employee's picnic. The events are small, but vivid. Meanwhile, operators filmed new items and soon announced a change in program with local events. The filming of these was done as publicly as possible. The idea was to lure people to the shows in the hopes of seeing themselves, which they sometimes did. In any event, the local items were often the high spot of the run. In Spain, arrival of toreadors. In Russia, the coronation of Nicholas II. And in Australia, the Melbourne races, all 1896 products. To local audiences, they seemed ultimate proof that the cinematograph was no trick. The arrival of such material from abroad rapidly enriched the catalog, so that operators went forth with increasingly international assortments. The Lumiere program, shown at Proctor's Pleasure Palace in New York City in March 1897, included a gondola scene in Venice, 59th Street opposite Central Park, a scene near South Kensington, London, a snow battle at Lyon, France, and the Bath of Minerva at Milan, Italy. For wandering operators, improvisation became a habit. Because they hand-cranked in shooting and projection, they quickly learned the uses, such as comic, dramatic, or symbolic, of slowed or speeded motion. During projection, a sequence could also be reversed for amusing or meaningful effect. This device was used early in the Salon Indien. A wall was raised, then put itself together again. This became a standard feature of cinematograph showings. At the end of 1897, the Lumiere Company announced a sudden change in policy. The company would discontinue its world demonstration tours and would instead proceed to sell its equipment to anyone who wished to buy. The Lumieres would thenceforth concentrate on the manufacture and sale of cinematographs, raw film, and films in the Lumiere catalog. A strange and dizzying chapter had come to an end. In Sweden, where the Lumiere opening run had lasted more than a year, Alexandre Promio taught cinematography in 1897 to Ernest Florman. Florman, the son of a court photographer, became Sweden's first cinematographer. The Danish royal photographer, Peter Elfelt, had visited Paris in 1896 and had tried to buy Lumiere equipment but had been refused. He, however, managed to have similar equipment built by a Copenhagen master mechanic and began film production and showings. Early projects dealt with Greenland dogs, street scenes, and royal ceremonies. In England, former Lumiere operator Felix Meswich went to work for Charles Urban, who had come to London as an Edison representative. His company soon became one of England's most productive enterprises, specializing in documentary films. Antonio Ramos, a Spaniard who, upon finishing military service in the Philippines, became one of the first to buy a Lumiere cinematograph. He also bought 20 Lumiere films, with which he inaugurated the motion picture era in the Philippines. The films that Louis Lumiere had shot himself in 1895 and 1896 had often been fascinating reflections of French middle-class life. But in the cinematograph tours of his emissaries, as a matter of promotional practice, they had sought royal sponsorship and with triumphant success. All of this facilitated access to official functions and clinched other permissions, but the filmmen paid a price. They ultimately became purveyors of royal performances and agents of imperial public relations. Theodore Roosevelt was an especially eager performer. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, he showed, according to Albert E. Smith, Vitagraph's co-founder, a willingness to halt his march up San Juan Hill and strike a pose. Along with worldwide ties to rulers, there came, perhaps inevitably, growing involvement with military leaders. Spanish-American War coverage was such a bonanza for Vitagraph that Biograph, the following year, sent its co-founder and chief cameraman, W.K.L. Dixon, Edison's aide during the kinetoscope days, to photograph the Boer War. Cinematographers were also on hand for the Boxer Rebellion and provided footage of the Russo-Japanese War from both sides. The leading film-producing countries of this period were, it's important to point out, nations with colonial empires. Not surprisingly, their work reflected the attitudes that made up the colonial rationale. Coverage of so-called natives generally showed them to be charming, quaint, sometimes mysterious, often loyal, and grateful for the protection and guidance of Europeans. Europeans were interested in colorful native rituals, costumes, dances, and processions. Along with these colonialist tendencies, documentary film was increasingly infected by fakery. A 1902 film shot by Méliès in Paris, for example, that depicted the coronation of Edward VII in Westminster Abbey, was announced as an authentic reconstitution. Film companies didn't want to ignore headline events merely because their cameraman couldn't get there. Enterprise filled the gap. British producer James Williamson, for example, shot his 1898 Attack on a Chinese Mission Station in his backyard and some of his Boer War scenes on a golf course. The snows of Long Island and New Jersey provided settings for such action as Biograph's 1904 Battle of the Yalu and a competing Edison film, skirmish between Russian and Japanese advance guards. Amid such projects, the documentary tended to become a dubious and perfunctory part of film programs. The rise of multi-reel fiction films, and then of film stars, downgraded it even further. But the seeds for what documentary film could, and ultimately would become throughout the 20th century, were firmly sown. Louis Lumière, in his first film, Workers Leaving the Lumière Factory, was making what would later be called an industrial film and was acting as a promoter. In The Arrival of the Conventioners, he was a reporter. The maker of Woodcutters in the Street in Paris was more of a genre painter. In the works of many Lumière operators, such as the panoramas of Venice and other cities, and the later Coolies at Saigon, we see the documentarist as a travel lecturer. In films of the Charles Urban Bioscope Expeditions, a series launched in 1903 to depict remote areas, we see the documentarist as popular educator. Urban assumed a similar function in science with his microbioscope series, Unseen World, launched in 1903, and including items such as cheese mites. Of course, none of these functions can be neatly separated. They never occur separately. The documentarist is always more than one of these, yet on different occasions, at different moments in history, the documentarist tends to bring different functions to the fore. This was true in the first decade of documentary history, and it remained true in later decades.